an original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. The Duke of Caradale stands in the doorway of his wife's bedroom, one hand still gripping the brass handle, and watches Cora fold a traveling dress with the same careful precision she brings to everything she does. Winter light falls through the tall windows behind her, cold and unforgiving, illuminating the open trunk at the foot of the bed, and the small pile of belongings she has already packed. She does not turn when he enters. She does not pause. Her fingers smooth the fabric, tuck the sleeves inward, lay the garment flat with a gentleness that makes his chest tighten. He has seen her perform 1,000 domestic rituals in their 10 years of marriage. But this one feels different, final. He wants to speak, to ask what she is doing, but the question dies in his throat because he already knows. She is leaving, and she is doing it without anger, without tears, without any of the drama he might have known how to answer. He does not move from the doorway. His hand remains on the handle, as though it might anchor him, as though releasing it would mean accepting what is happening. The diagonal line between his outstretched arm and her open trunk cuts the room in half, a visual rupture that mirrors the chasm he has only just begun to understand. She reaches for another garment, a shawl this time, deep green wool that he remembers buying for her 3 winters ago. He had it sent to her room. He cannot recall if she ever thanked him. He cannot recall if he ever asked. "Cora," he says finally, and his voice sounds foreign in the silence. She pauses, her hand still on the shawl, but she does not look at him. "I will be staying with my cousin in Northumberland," she says. Her voice is calm, measured, the same tone she uses when instructing the housekeeper or responding to dinner invitations. "I have informed Mrs. Henley. The household will continue as usual." As usual. The phrase strikes him as absurd. Nothing about this is usual. And yet he understands what she means. The house will run smoothly in her absence, because she has built it to run smoothly, whether she is present or not. She has made herself unnecessary, or perhaps he has made her so. "For how long?" he asks. She folds the shawl and places it in the trunk. "I have not decided." He wants to tell her that she cannot simply leave, that they have obligations, appearances to maintain, a life constructed with care over a decade. But the words feel hollow even before he speaks them, and so he remains silent. Silence has always been easier. Silence has always felt safer. She closes the trunk with a soft click. The sound reverberates through the room like the closing of a door, final and irreversible. She straightens, smooths her skirts, and finally turns to face him. Her expression is composed, her eyes clear. There is no accusation in her gaze, no bitterness. That, somehow, is worse than anger would have been. "The carriage will be ready within the hour," she says. He nods, because he does not know what else to do. She moves past him, close enough that he can smell the faint lavender of her soap, and he has the sudden, irrational urge to reach for her, to place a hand on her arm, to ask her to stay. But he does not. He has spent 10 years not reaching for her. He does not know how to start now. She descends the stairs with the same quiet grace she has always possessed, and he watches from the landing as she speaks briefly to Mrs. Henley in the entrance hall. The housekeeper nods, her face carefully neutral, and disappears toward the kitchens. Cora pulls on her gloves, adjusts her traveling cloak, and steps outside without looking back. He moves to the window in the drawing room, the one that overlooks the front drive. The carriage is already waiting. The horse is stamping in the cold. A footman loads her trunk. She climbs inside without assistance, settles into her seat, and the door closes. The driver calls to the horses. The wheels begin to turn. He watches until the carriage disappears beyond the line of bare trees at the edge of the estate. The house is silent around him. It has always been silent, he realizes. But now the silence feels different. Now it feels like absence. Their wedding had been everything a ducal wedding should be. The ceremony took place in the chapel at Caradale House, attended by 200 guests from the finest families in England. Cora wore ivory silk and a veil that had belonged to his grandmother. He wore the formal dress of his title and spoke his vows with the same steady composure he brought to all public occasions. She was 19. He was 26. They had met twice before the engagement was finalized. He remembers standing beside her at the altar and thinking that she was lovely in the way. A painting is lovely, something to be admired from a respectful distance. She had smiled at him once during the vows, a small, tentative expression that he had not known how to return. He had nodded instead, a gesture meant to convey approval, and her smile had faded. The wedding breakfast was elaborate. Toasts were made. His father, still alive then, had clapped him on the shoulder and told him he had done well. Cora's mother had wept with what he assumed was happiness. Cora herself had sat beside him at the head table, her hands folded in her lap, and said very little. He had not minded. He preferred quiet to chatter. Their wedding night had been brief and awkward, a duty performed with as much dignity as possible. Afterward, she had lain beside him in the dark, and he had felt her waiting for something. A word, a touch, some acknowledgement of what had passed between them. He had said nothing. He had turned onto his side and closed his eyes and told himself that tenderness would come with time. But time had not brought tenderness. Time had brought routine. They settled into the rhythms of married life with the ease of two people who understood their roles. She managed the household. He managed the estate. They dined together most evenings, seated at opposite ends of a table, long enough to seat 12. The candles between them cast long shadows. The servants moved soundlessly, pouring wine, clearing plates, their presence a buffer against the need for conversation. He would ask her polite questions. How was her day? Had she received correspondence from her family? Did she require anything from London? She would answer with equal politeness. Her day had been pleasant. Her mother was well. She required nothing. Thank you. He told himself this was how marriages of their class functioned. Affection was not a requirement. Respect was enough. Stability was enough. But gradually, imperceptibly, the distance between them grew. They began taking breakfast in separate rooms. He rose early and ate in the library while reading the morning papers. She took her tea in the morning room, where the light was better for her correspondence. It was more efficient, he reasoned. There was no need to disrupt each other's routines. They occupied separate wings of the house. His rooms faced east, toward the parkland. Hers faced south, toward the gardens. He would pass her door sometimes on his way to his study, and hear the faint sound of her moving within, a drawer closing, the rustle of fabric, and he would continue walking. She never called to him. He never knocked. At night, he would lie in his bed and know that she was lying in hers, 30 feet away down a carpeted corridor, and the distance felt both necessary and unbearable, but he did not cross it. To cross it would have required something he did not know how to give: vulnerability, need, the admission that he wanted more than the careful, controlled life they had built. Years passed. Seasons changed. The house remained immaculate, the estate prosperous, their marriage intact in every way that mattered to the outside world. And Cora, patient and gracious, learned not to ask for what he would not give. She stopped trying to catch his eye across the dinner table. She stopped lingering in doorways, as though hoping he might invite her to stay. She stopped asking him questions that required more than factual answers. She became, in all the ways that mattered, invisible. And he told himself that this was kindness, that by not burdening her with expectations, by not imposing his presence, he was granting her freedom. He told himself that silence was a form of respect. He was wrong. Cora's days at Caradale House followed a pattern so predictable she could navigate them without thought. She woke at 7, dressed with the help of her maid, a quiet girl named Mary, who had been with her since the early years of her marriage. Took breakfast in the morning room, reviewed the day's menus with Mrs. Henley, attended to correspondence. The letters came in a steady stream: invitations to dinners and balls and country house parties, requests for charitable donations, notes from her mother, her sisters, old school friends who had married and scattered across England. She answered them all with careful attention, her handwriting neat and even, her tone warm without being effusive. She accepted some invitations and declined others. She sent money to the charities her mother favored. She inquired after her friends' children and congratulated them on their husbands' appointments and promotions. She never mentioned her own life. There was nothing to mention. After correspondence, she would walk the gardens if the weather permitted. The head gardener had been at Caradale for 40 years and took great pride in his work. The roses were his particular passion. He would show her new plantings, describe his plans for the spring beds, ask her opinion on whether the clematis should be trained over the south wall or left to climb the arbor. She always gave an opinion. Mr. Tibbs always thanked her. She suspected he would have done exactly as he pleased regardless. But she appreciated the courtesy of being asked. In the afternoons, she read. The library at Caradale House was extensive, built over generations, and she had worked her way through much of it. Novels mostly, poetry, the occasional history or biography. She avoided anything too heavy, too demanding. She wanted distraction, not engagement. Sometimes she would sit in the drawing room and work on her embroidery, though she had no particular talent for it and no real interest, but it gave her hands something to do. It filled the hours. The Duke was rarely present during the day. He spent his mornings with his steward, reviewing accounts and tenant matters. His afternoons were occupied with correspondence of his own, or meetings with his solicitor, or trips to London when Parliament was in session. When he was home, he kept to his study or the library. She would hear his footsteps in the corridor sometimes, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to a servant, but he did not seek her out, and she had long since stopped seeking him. Dinner was the only time they reliably occupied the same space. She would dress carefully, choose a gown that was appropriate but not ostentatious, and descend to the dining room at precisely 8 o'clock. He was always already there, standing by the fireplace with a glass of wine, his posture straight and formal. He would nod to her as she entered. She would nod back. They would sit. The meal would be served. The food was always excellent. Mrs. Henley ran the kitchens with the same efficiency she brought to the rest of the household, but Cora tasted none of it. She ate because it was expected. She made polite remarks about the quality of the fish, or the tenderness of the lamb. He would agree. The servants would refill their glasses. The candles would burn lower. Sometimes she would glance down the length of the table and find him looking at her, not with interest, not with warmth, but with a kind of distant assessment. As though she were a piece of furniture he was evaluating for wear. She would meet his gaze for a moment, and then he would look away, and the moment would pass. After dinner, he would retire to his study. She would retire to her sitting room. They would not see each other again until the following evening. It was a life of perfect order, perfect emptiness. She began to notice the small ways in which she had been erased. A question she asked at breakfast that he did not answer. His attention already on the newspaper in his hand. A door that closed just as she approached. Not rudely, but with a timing that suggested he had not registered her presence. His gaze that slid over her in passing, as though she were part of the wallpaper. Expected and unremarkable. She did not blame him. Blame required anger, and she was not angry. She was tired. Tired of waiting for something that would never come. Tired of pretending that this half-life was enough. One morning in late autumn, she woke and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and realized she could not remember the last time he had spoken her name. Not "my dear," which he used occasionally in the presence of others. Not Duchess, which was a title, not a name, but Cora, her name, the sound of it in his voice. She could not remember. She rose, dressed, went through the motions of her day, but something had shifted. A decision she had not known she was making had been made. She would leave. Not dramatically, not with accusations or tears or demands. She would leave the way she had lived here, quietly, competently, without fuss. She would go somewhere she could breathe. Somewhere she could remember who she was before she became invisible. She began to plan. Cora did not write a letter of explanation. What would she say? That she was leaving because he had ignored her. That sounded petulant, childish. That she was leaving because she could no longer bear the loneliness of their marriage. That sounded weak. That she was leaving because staying would mean disappearing entirely. That was the truth. But it was not a truth she could put into words without unraveling. So she said nothing. She informed Mrs. Henley that she would be visiting her cousin in Northumberland, a woman she had not seen in 5 years, but who had always extended a standing invitation. Mrs. Henley's expression remained carefully neutral. But Cora saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. The household staff knew. Of course they knew. They saw everything. "Will His Grace be accompanying you, Your Grace?" Mrs. Henley asked. "No," Cora said. "He has business here." Mrs. Henley nodded. Shall I arrange for your maid to accompany you? No. My cousin has staff enough. I will travel alone. Another nod. No questions. No judgment. Just the quiet efficiency that had characterized their working relationship for a decade. Cora packed her own trunk. She did not take much. A few dresses, practical rather than formal. Her warmest cloak. A book she had been meaning to read. She left her jewelry in its case. All except the plain gold band on her finger. She considered leaving that as well. But the gesture felt too pointed. Too final. She was not ending the marriage. She was simply stepping away from it. The morning she left, the house was quiet. The Duke was in his study, or perhaps out riding. She did not check. She descended the stairs, pulled on her gloves, and stepped into the carriage without looking back. The wheels crunched over gravel. The horses pulled forward. She watched Caradale House recede through the window, its pale stone facade elegant and cold in the winter light, and felt nothing. Not relief, not sorrow, just a vast echoing blankness. The journey north took 2 days. She stayed at coaching inns, ate meals in public dining rooms, spoke to no one beyond what courtesy required. The landscape changed as she traveled, softer hills giving way to harder, rockier terrain, the air growing colder, the sky wider. She felt herself expanding into the space, breathing more deeply, sitting straighter. Her cousin's estate was modest by the standards Cora had grown accustomed to, but it was warm and welcoming in a way Caradale House had never been. Her cousin, a widow named Eleanor, greeted her with genuine affection and asked no prying questions. She showed Cora to a small, comfortable room with a view of the moors, and told her she could stay as long as she liked. Cora unpacked her few belongings, sat on the edge of the bed, and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to cry. The Duke of Caradale stood at the window of his study and watched the empty drive. 3 days had passed since Cora left. He had told himself she would return within the week. A brief visit to her cousin, a change of scenery, nothing more. But the house felt different in her absence, larger, colder. The silence that had always been a comfort now pressed against him like a weight. He tried to maintain his routines. He met with his steward. He reviewed the estate accounts. He answered correspondence. But he found himself distracted, his attention drifting. He would look up from a letter and realize he had been staring at the same sentence for 5 minutes without reading it. At dinner, he sat alone at the long table. The servants set a place for him at the head, as always, but the other end remained empty. He found himself glancing down the table, expecting to see her there, and the absence was jarring. He had not realized how much of his sense of normalcy depended on her presence, even if that presence had been silent and distant. He began noticing the small things she had done, the routines she had maintained. Fresh flowers in the entrance hall, replaced weekly. The morning room aired and dusted, ready for her correspondence. The way the household ran smoothly, invisibly, because she had organized it to do so. Mrs. Henley continued her work with the same efficiency. But there was a coolness in her manner now, a formality that had not been there before. The other servants, too, seemed more distant. They performed their duties without fault. But the ease that had characterized the household was gone. He realized, with a creeping discomfort, that they blamed him. They knew why Cora had left, even if he was only beginning to understand it himself. One morning he found himself in the morning room, the space where Cora had always taken her breakfast. The table was bare. The curtains were drawn back, letting in pale winter light. He stood in the doorway and tried to remember the last time he'd entered this room, while she was in it. He could not. A week passed, then 2. A letter arrived from Eleanor, brief and polite, confirming that Cora had arrived safely and was in good health. She sent no personal message, no indication of when she might return. He read the letter 3 times, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue to her state of mind. There was nothing, just courtesy and distance. He considered writing to her, demanding her return, reminding her of her duties. But the words felt wrong, hollow. What right did he have to demand anything? He had given her nothing. He had been present in body, and absent in every other way that mattered. He began walking the estate in the afternoons, something he rarely did. The cold air stung his face. The bare trees stood stark against gray skies. He walked to the edge of the parkland, to the gardens, to the small folly at the top of the hill that overlooked the house. He stood there and looked down at Caradale, at the life he had built with such care, and wondered why it felt like a mausoleum. One evening, he entered the library and found himself drawn to the chair where Cora used to sit. It was positioned near the fire, with good light for reading. He sat down and realized the cushion still held a faint indentation, as though her body had left an impression. He placed his hand on it, felt the coolness of the fabric, and something in his chest tightened. He missed her. The realization was so simple, so obvious, that he almost laughed. Of course he missed her. She was his wife. But it was more than that. He missed her presence, her quiet competence, the way she moved through the house with grace and purpose. He missed the possibility of her, the potential for connection that he had ignored for so long. He had thought silence was safety. He had thought distance was kindness. He had been wrong. A month after she left, he made a decision. He would go to her. Not to command her return, not to assert his authority as her husband, but because remaining at Caradale had become unbearable. He did not know what he would say. He did not know if she would even agree to see him, but he had to try. He informed his steward that he would be traveling north. He packed a small bag, and on a cold morning in December, he climbed into his carriage and set out for Northumberland. Eleanor's estate was smaller than he had expected. A manor house of gray stone surrounded by windswept moors. The landscape was harsh and beautiful, the sky vast and unforgiving. He stood outside the front door and felt, for the first time in years, uncertain. A servant answered his knock and showed him to a small drawing room. The furnishings were simple but comfortable. The fire warm. He waited, standing because sitting felt too presumptuous, his hat in his hands. Cora entered after a few minutes. She wore a simple day dress, her hair arranged without fuss. She looked different here, not diminished, as he had half expected, but more solid, more present. The northern light suited her. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was calm, measured. "Cora," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth felt strange, unfamiliar. She gestured to a chair. "Please sit." He sat. She took a seat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The silence stretched between them. But it was not the comfortable silence of their marriage. It was charged, expectant. "I wanted to see how you were," he said finally. "I am well," she said. "Thank you. The house is." He paused, searching for the right word. "Empty, without you." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. It has always been empty. The words were not accusatory. They were simply true. And he could not argue with them. "What do you need?" he asked. And the question surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. What do you need?" he repeated. "Practically. Materially. I want to ensure you are provided for." She stared at him, as though he had spoken a foreign language. I have not thought about it." "Think about it now." She was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she said, "I need nothing from you, Your Grace. Eleanor has been more than generous. That is not what I asked." Her gaze sharpened. "Why are you here?" He did not have a good answer, or rather, he had an answer he did not know how to articulate. "Because I miss you. Because the house is unbearable without you. Because I have spent 10 years building a life that means nothing. I wanted to see you," he said finally. "That is all." She studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable sense that she was seeing through him, past the careful composure to the confusion beneath. "I'm glad you are well," he said, standing. "I will not intrude further." "You are leaving." There was something in her voice, not disappointment, exactly, but surprise. "Unless you wish me to stay." She hesitated. Then quietly she said, "I do not know what I wish." He nodded. "Then I will leave the choice to you. If you wish to return to Caradale, you are welcome. If you wish to remain here, I will ensure you have everything you need. The decision is yours." He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect, and turned to leave. At the door he paused. "Cora," he said, and she looked up. "I am sorry. For everything." He left before she could respond, before he could see her reaction, because he did not trust himself to bear it. He climbed into his carriage and began the long journey back to Caradale. And for the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of what he had lost. Back in London, in the quiet offices of estate solicitors and the hushed drawing rooms of Mayfair, a rumor began to circulate. It was a small thing at first, barely a whisper. the kind of gossip that spreads through the highest circles like smoke, invisible until it is everywhere. It began with a ledger. The Duke of Caradale's estate steward, preparing the annual financial records for review, had listed the Duchess's allowance in a particular way. The phrasing was technically accurate, but ambiguous. Obligations sustained. It was meant to be discreet, a way of categorizing expenses without drawing attention. But discretion, in the hands of those looking for scandal, can become suspicion. A clerk mentioned it to another clerk. A solicitor raised an eyebrow over brandy at his club. A society matron, hearing it third hand, repeated it with a certain inflection that changed its meaning entirely. Obligations sustained, as though the Duchess were a burden, a dependent, a kept woman rather than a wife. The rumor spread quietly, as the most damaging rumors do. It was not shouted in ballrooms or printed in scandal sheets. It was murmured behind fans, implied in carefully worded letters, suggested in the pauses between polite conversation. The Duchess of Caradale, absent from society, living in the north. The Duke, alone at Caradale House. The accounts, phrased so strangely. What did it mean? What did it suggest? For women of Cora's class, reputation was currency. It was the foundation on which marriages were built. Alliances formed. Social standing maintained. A woman could survive many things: illness, financial difficulty, even scandal, if it was the right kind. But she could not survive the quiet erosion of respect, the subtle implication that she was less than she should be. The Duke of Caradale learned of the rumor from his solicitor, a man named Greaves, who had served the family for 30 years. Greaves came to Caradale House on a cold January afternoon, his expression grave. "Your Grace," he said, settling into the chair across from the Duke's desk. "There is a matter we must discuss." The Duke set down his pen. "Go on." Greaves hesitated, choosing his words with care. "There has been some, in London, regarding the Duchess." The Duke's jaw tightened. "What kind of talk?" "The financial records. The phrasing used by your steward. It has been misinterpreted. There are those who suggest that her Grace is, that she has been." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "Speak plainly, Greaves." "They are suggesting that she is a burden to you, your Grace, that her absence is a relief, that she has been maintained out of obligation rather than—" He paused. "Rather than affection." The Duke felt something cold settle in his chest. "That is absurd. I agree, your Grace, but the damage is done. The rumor has spread, and rumors, once started, are difficult to stop." The Duke stood, paced to the window. Outside, the gardens lay dormant under a light dusting of snow. He thought of Cora, alone in Northumberland, unaware that her reputation, her only remaining currency, was being quietly dismantled. "What must be done?" he asked. "A public gesture," Greaves said. "Something that clarifies her position, her autonomy. Something that cannot be misinterpreted." The Duke turned to face him. "Be specific." Greaves opened his leather case and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "I have drafted a proposal. It would require your signature, and it would be significant." The Duke took the papers, scanned them. As he read, he felt the ground shift beneath him. What Greaves was proposing was not a minor adjustment. It was a complete restructuring of his authority, his control, his power within the marriage. "This would grant her independent income," the Duke said slowly, "outside of my oversight." "Yes, your Grace. It would revise the estate records, make clear her status as an equal partner, not a dependent." "Yes. It would cost me." He paused, searching for the right word. "Everything." Greaves met his gaze steadily. "It would cost you authority, your Grace, but it would restore her dignity, and in doing so, it would restore the truth." The Duke looked down at the papers in his hands. The legal language was precise, unambiguous. If he signed this, he would be relinquishing control, not just financial, but social, legal, the very structure that had defined their marriage. He would be admitting, publicly and irrevocably, that his silence had been wrong, that his control had been harm. He thought of Cora, folding her clothes with quiet precision. He thought of the empty chair at dinner. He thought of 10 years of silence, and the cost of that silence, a cost he was only beginning to understand. "Prepare the documents," he said. "I will sign them." Greaves nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "Very good, your Grace." After the solicitor left, the Duke remained at his desk, staring at the papers. This was not an apology. Apologies were words, and words were easy. This was a price, a real material sacrifice. It was the only language he had left. The winter glasshouse at Caradale stood at the edge of the formal gardens. A structure of iron and glass that housed plants capable of surviving the cold. The Duke had always found it an odd, melancholy place, neither inside nor outside, neither warm nor entirely frozen. But it was where he went now, in the gray afternoon light, because he could not bear the house. Inside, the air was cool but not frigid. The plants grew in careful rows. Hellebores with their pale, drooping flowers, winter jasmine, bright yellow against dark stems. Skeletal vines that would bloom again in spring. He walked slowly between them, his breath visible in the cold air. He had been thinking about a moment, a small, inconsequential moment from years ago, that he had not thought about since it happened. But now it returned to him with the clarity of something recently experienced. It had been winter then too. Early in their marriage, perhaps the second or third year, they had been walking in the gardens. A rare occasion, when they had been outside together. The path had been icy, treacherous. Cora had stepped forward, and her foot had slipped. She had reached out instinctively, her hand extended toward him, her body tilting. He had seen her reach for him. He had felt the instinct to step forward, to steady her, to catch her if she fell, and he had deliberately stepped back. She had caught herself, regained her balance, continued walking as though nothing had happened. But he had seen her face in that moment, the brief flash of surprise, of hurt, before she composed herself. He had told himself it was propriety, that it would have been inappropriate to touch her so familiarly in public, even in their own gardens. That restraint was the mark of a gentleman, but standing now in the cold glasshouse, surrounded by plants that survived through patience and adaptation, he understood the truth. It had been fear, fear of closeness, fear of need, fear of the vulnerability that came with caring for another person. He had associated love with loss, with disorder, with the kind of emotional chaos he had spent his life avoiding, and so he had stepped back. Not once, but 1,000 times. Every time she had reached for him, literally or figuratively, he had stepped back. No one had witnessed that moment in the garden. There was no record of it, no letter, no confession. It existed only in his memory, and perhaps in hers. But it was the truth of their marriage, distilled into a single gesture. She had reached for him. He had refused her. He sat down on a wooden bench, cold and hard beneath him, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done, not through cruelty, not through malice, but through a relentless, cowardly silence. He had told himself that silence was kindness, that by not imposing his emotions, his needs, his presence, he was protecting her. But silence was not kindness. Silence was erasure. And he had spent 10 years erasing the woman he had married. The light was fading outside, the winter sun sinking toward the horizon. He sat in the glasshouse and understood, finally, that his silence had not been wisdom. It had been paralysis. And the price of that paralysis was a life, 2 lives, lived in the cold. The documents were drawn up within a week. Greaves presented them to the Duke in his study, along with the seals and signatures required to make them legally binding. The Duke read through them carefully, though he already knew what they contained. The settlement granted Cora an independent income, drawn from the estate, but outside his control. It clarified her status in the household records, removing any ambiguity about her position. It restored her autonomy, financial, social, legal. It gave her the power to leave, permanently, if she chose. "This is irrevocable," Greaves said. "Once signed, it cannot be undone without her consent." "I understand," the Duke said. "It will be noticed, Your Grace, in London. Among your peers it is unusual." "I do not care," Greaves nodded. "Very well." The Duke signed his name at the bottom of each document, the scratch of the pen loud in the quiet room. When he was finished, Greaves applied the ducal seal, pressing the wax with a heavy signet ring. The documents were official, binding, final. "I will have these delivered to Her Grace," Greaves said. "No," the Duke said. "I will deliver them myself." Greaves raised an eyebrow, but did not argue. "As you wish, Your Grace." The Duke placed the documents in a leather case, along with a brief letter explaining their contents. He did not ask for her forgiveness. He did not plead for her return. He simply stated the facts, what he had done, what it meant, and that the choice of what to do next was entirely hers. He traveled north again, through snow and cold, the landscape harsh and unforgiving. When he arrived at Eleanor's estate, he did not request an audience. He simply left the case with the servant at the door, along with a message. For the Duchess of Carradale, from her husband. Then he returned to Carradale House and waited. Cora received the documents on a gray morning in late January. She opened the case in her small room, the fire crackling softly in the grate, and read through them with growing disbelief. Independent income, revised estate records, legal autonomy. The language was precise, unambiguous. He was giving her power, real material power, the power to leave, the power to stay, the power to choose. She read the letter that accompanied the documents. It was brief, almost curt in its formality, but the meaning was clear. He was not asking her to return. He was not demanding anything. He was simply releasing her. She sat with the documents in her lap for a long time, staring into the fire. She did not know what to feel. Anger, perhaps, that it had taken 10 years and her departure for him to act. Relief that she now had the means to build a life independent of him. Confusion about what this gesture meant, what it said about his intentions. But beneath all of that, there was something else, a small, fragile curiosity. Why had he done this? What had changed? And was it possible, was it even conceivable, that the man who had ignored her for a decade might be capable of something more? She made a decision, not to return, not yet, but to go to Carradale, to see him, to understand. She traveled south in early February, the landscape slowly softening as she moved away from the harsh northern moors. When she arrived at Carradale House, the servants greeted her with a warmth that surprised her. Mrs. Henley's eyes were bright with something that looked like relief. Her Grace, the housekeeper said, and there was no formality in the words, only genuine gladness. Is he here? Cora asked. In the glass house, Your Grace. He spends most of his time there now. Cora nodded. She did not go to her rooms. She did not change out of her traveling clothes. She walked directly through the gardens, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and found him. The winter glass house was filled with pale light. The glass panes frosted at the edges. The Duke stood among the plants, his back to her, his hands resting on the edge of a wooden table. He did not turn when she entered, but she saw his shoulders tense, as though he had been expecting her. You came, he said, his voice low. I did. He turned to face her. He looked different, tired. There was a vulnerability in his expression that she had never seen before, a rawness that made her chest tighten. Why? She asked. Why did you do it? He did not pretend to misunderstand. Because it was the only way to give you what you should have had from the beginning. Freedom. I did not ask for freedom. I asked for. She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. For what? He asked gently. For you, she said, and the words came out more forcefully than she intended. I asked for you. For 10 years I asked, and you gave me nothing. He flinched, but he did not look away. I know. Then why now? Why, after all this time, do you suddenly care? I have always cared, he said, and his voice was rough. I simply did not know how to show it. I thought silence was protection. I thought distance was kindness. I was wrong. She stared at him, searching his face for deception, for manipulation, for anything that might suggest this was a performance. But there was nothing. Only honesty, stark and unadorned. I was a coward, he continued. I was afraid of love because I associated it with loss, with disorder, with vulnerability. And so I built a life where none of those things could touch me. But in doing so, I erased you. I made you invisible. And I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air between them. Simple and devastating. Cora felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. I do not know if I can forgive you, she said. I am not asking for forgiveness, he said. I am asking for the chance to do better, to be better. Not as your husband in the way I was before, but as, he hesitated, as someone who sees you, who values you, who will spend the rest of his life proving that you matter. She looked around the glass house, at the plants that survived the cold through patience and resilience. And if I say no, if I take the freedom you have given me and leave, then I will accept it, he said, because you deserve that choice. You have always deserved it. She was silent for a long moment, the cold air sharp in her lungs, the pale light falling across them both. She thought of 10 years of silence, of dinners at opposite ends of a table, of a hand reaching out and finding nothing. But she also thought of the documents he had signed, the power he had relinquished, the truth he had finally spoken. "I will not return as your duchess," she said finally. "Not as I was. I would not ask you to. If I stay, it will be on new terms. As two people choosing each other, daily, without obligation, without debt." "Yes," he said, and the word was almost a breath. She stepped closer, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray beginning to thread through his hair. "I do not trust you yet," she said, "but I am willing to try." He nodded, and for the first time in 10 years, he reached for her, not to claim, not to possess, but simply to offer. His hand extended, palm up, waiting. She looked at his hand for a long moment. Then slowly, she placed hers in it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. They stood together in the cold glass house, surrounded by life that persisted against winter, and began again. The weeks that followed were strange and tentative. Cora remained at Caradale House, but she did not resume her old routines. She moved through the estate as a guest rather than a mistress, occupying her rooms, but not claiming authority over the household. Mrs. Henley continued to manage the staff with her usual efficiency, and Cora let her. The Duke did not presume. He did not reclaim. He did not command. Instead, he waited. He left her correspondence untouched on the table in the morning room. He asked her opinion on household matters, and listened when she answered. He appeared in rooms where she was, and did not fill the silence with empty words. They began taking breakfast together again, but not at the long formal table. Instead, they sat in the smaller morning room, at a round table where they could see each other's faces. He poured her tea without asking. She passed him the newspaper without prompting. Small gestures, but they felt monumental. One morning she asked him about the estate accounts, a question she had never dared to ask before. He answered without hesitation, explaining the tenant arrangements, the crop rotations, the investments that sustained the property. She listened, asked more questions, and he answered them all. It was the longest conversation they had ever had. In the afternoons, they walked the gardens together, not side by side, but close enough that their hands occasionally brushed. He pointed out the early signs of spring, buds forming on the trees, green shoots pushing through the cold earth. She told him about her time in Northumberland, about Eleanor, and the harsh beauty of the moors. He listened without interrupting, his attention wholly on her. They did not speak of the past, not yet. The wounds were too fresh, the history too heavy, but they inhabited the present with a cautious, deliberate honesty that felt like progress. One evening as they sat in the library after dinner, she looked up from her book and found him watching her. Not with the distant assessment of before, but with something softer, warmer. "What is it?" she asked. "I am glad you stayed," he said. She set down her book. "I am not certain I have stayed. Not yet." "I know," he said, "but I'm glad you are here, now." She considered him for a moment. "Ask me my name." He blinked, surprised. "I beg your pardon." "Ask me my name," she repeated. "Say it." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Cora," he said, and the sound of it was careful, reverent. "Your name is Cora." She felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had not known she was carrying. "Yes," she said, "it is." Spring arrived slowly, the cold giving way to warmth by degrees. The gardens bloomed. The days grew longer, and in the quiet spaces between words, between gestures, between the careful rebuilding of trust, something new began to grow. One morning in early March, Cora woke to find the door to the breakfast room standing open. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it was deliberate. The Duke had left it open, a gesture that said, "You are free to enter. You are free to leave. The choice is yours." She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the table set for two, the morning light streaming through the windows, the teapot steaming gently. He sat at the table, reading the newspaper, but he looked up when she entered and smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, but it was real. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied, and sat down across from him. He poured her tea without asking, the way he had every morning for the past month. She took the cup, felt the warmth of it in her hands, and allowed herself, for the first time, to hope. They were not what they had been. They would never be what they had been. But they were becoming something new, something built not on duty or obligation, but on choice, on presence, on the slow, difficult work of learning to see each other. Every morning, he left the door open. Every morning, she walked through it. And in those small, repeated gestures, they found a way forward. The story did not end with restoration. It ended with possibility. With the understanding that love, real love, was not a destination but a practice, a daily choice to show up, to be present, to offer without demanding, to see without possessing. They sat together in the morning light. The door opened behind them, and began the long, patient work of building a life that was theirs. Not perfect, not without pain, but real, and honest, and finally full of hope.